Duel Terminal World History, Age 1.0, The Worm Invasion to the Revival of Trishula. The worms appear, the continent's tribes fought each other to expand their territories and reign over the land. Seeking power, they waged a war that lasted ages, but it didn't end the way they expected, due to the appearance of the worms, invaders from outer space. These creatures, known as the worms, come from organic matter that clings to meteorites. They mutate to evolve and fit their environment, and then multiply. They are invasive lifeforms that consume and exhaust planets throughout the cosmos. All-out war against the worms, the tribes lacked information about the true nature of the worms, so they gathered large forces similar to army ants to fight the invaders. Each tribe was forced to reach a truce, and each began to fight the worms in its own way. The first ice dragon seal is broken. To deal with the army of worms covering the world, the ice barrier unleashed one of their sealed ice dragons, whose chilling aura pushed the invaders back. As for the non-ice barrier tribes, they dispatched powerful figures among their ranks to fight against the worms. They each displayed their power by making mincemeat of the gathered worm forces, slicing them to pieces and burning them to ash. The various assaults that rained down on the worms became the external stimulus that caused them to evolve in various ways, which resulted in the emergence of new beings that had adapted to deal with the attacks they'd suffered. The Allies of Justice are formed. As a result of the invasion, entire tribes began to die out, and the remaining tribes gathered and held a conference. They realized that they couldn't each oppose the invaders alone, and decided to join forces. Thus, the Alliance, Ally of Justice, was formed. It was headed by the four main tribes that had the most influence on the continent, and it began developing and producing anti-worm weapons, Fabled, Ice Barrier, X-Saber, and Mist Valley. The Alliance of Justice, Cat Aster, was built by a complete and perfect cooperation between the four tribes. It reaped major gains on the battlefield every time it was deployed. The worms and Genex come into contact. Around this time, the Ally of Justice engineers confirmed the existence of the Genex. Although their precise purpose was unknown, the Genex were observed to be silent creatures who seemed to have the ability to improve the environment around them. When they encountered the worms, they recognized them as outside invaders who polluted and destroyed the environment, so they began to eliminate them. Meanwhile, the Allies launched an investigation into the Genex's true nature. Controller allows the other Genex to reveal their full power through its ability to combine its central control core with them. The X-Sabers are formed. After many battles against the worms, the X-Sabers were injured. God Toms, their leader at the time, chose the next generation of swordsmen, the X-Sabers, and headed off to the battlefield once again. Every time the worms fought, their surviving members kept evolving, and ultimately, individuals with high levels of intelligence appeared. They gathered as a group and started commanding the lower-level worms. The X-Sabers fought bitterly against the worms, who outnumbered them. Hashul lost parts of his body in battle, but he replaced them with artificial limbs and returned to the battlefield despite his wounds. X-Saber, the next generation of X-Sabers, with Gotoms continuing to serve as leader. Using feedback from the various improvements to the Ally of Justice, each of the members put on equipment with mechanical functions. The worms invade Naturia forest. As the days passed, the conflict spread across the entire continent, and the intensity of the worm attacks increased. Their slimy claws finally reached the peaceful Naturia, who joined together to match the power of the invaders and protect their home. The Naturia tribe is fundamentally pacifist, but they could not overlook the worm invasion that polluted their beautiful forest, so they confronted them bravely without a single member stepping back in fear. Ally of Justice Field Marshal wages a fierce battle. The warriors see a valiant figure towering over the battlefield, shining in their hopeful eyes, Field Marshal. But it had been severely damaged on the way to the battlefield by a great number of worms, so it was deemed beyond repair, and was abandoned. Since the existing technology of the Allies of Justice wasn't enough to create a control system for their large weapon, they captured Genex spare and used it as their central control core. Mist Valley withdraws from the Allies of Justice. The technicians of the Allies of Justice investigated the meteorite that came from the Worm home star system, and they discovered an unknown substance in it which they used to complete the Ally mine. Experimentally equipping it allowed the computing power of the Allies of Justice to rise by leaps and bounds. Although it couldn't be miniaturized with the technology available to the Allies of Justice, it managed to increase weapon performance with its high tuning ability. The Allies began to mass-produce weapons for the purpose of capturing worms rather than killing them. The Mist Valley tribe had small doubts about the Allies' policy of taking advantage of the voiceless Genex, since they weren't enemies. These feelings were tiny at first, but the Fabled amplified them into a great distrust for the rest of the Alliance. As a result, Mist Valley left the Allies of Justice, all according to the schemes of the Fabled. At the same time, the Allies began developing the Cosmic Gateway, but the development was rough, as they were unable to get the machine to produce the proper output. The Fabled tribe revives. Perhaps they were awakened by the mayhem on the surface, or perhaps by the Allies' dimensional interference experiments. Either way, the Fabled, who had been sleeping since time immemorial, awoke and led their minions to the surface world. The philosophy of the Fabled is, be faithful to your desires. In accordance with that ideal, these evil gods refuse to aid the tribes, only bothering to interfere in the surface dwellers' fights when it suits their own enjoyment. The Genex began to repair themselves and optimize their designs toward a more combat-oriented style. Meanwhile, Fabled Leviathan appeared on the planet's surface. The Fabled descend upon the Jurak. The awakened Fabled appeared in the Jurak nest's vicinity and attacked it. Worm invasions were relatively rare there, so the Jurak were able to join forces and fight back. The Fabled found the counterattack of the Jurak to be stronger than they expected, and realized their prey was more formidable than they'd imagined, which made them smile with joy. At this time, the engineers of the Allies of Justice started intervening in the evolution of the Genex. The proud Jurak clan refused to let themselves become the hunted, and they fought back together against the Fabled with everything they had. The flames that clothed their bodies became fires of unity with their comrades, and with them, they burned the Fabled, who had become the hunters, to ash. The Genex evolved into the Argenex. In order to make a new energy source for the Allies of Justice, the Ally of Justice engineers implanted the real fusion reactor into certain Genex monsters, which evolved into Argenex. The seal of Gungnir is broken. On top of the worms, the Fabled became a new enemy, turning the surface world into a pot of chaos. In order to stop the vast army of worms, who continued to march day and night, and to counter the threat of the elusive Fabled, the Ice Barrier freed the second Ice Dragon. The second Ice Dragon's seal is broken. With its body freed from the seal, Gungnir began to dance across the battlefield as if trembling with joy. Its breath turned the invaders and wicked gods into immobile ice sculptures. The Drag Unity appear from Mist Valley. After leaving the Allies of Justice, the Mist Valley fought on their own. However, the strongest weapon in their arsenal was the lone Mistworm, and when it was defeated, it seemed like their troops would be completely routed, and that was when the legendary Dragon Knights rode into the rescue. The Drag Unity, whose existence was partially considered a legend, are said to dwell in the Dragon Ravine. They are a tribe that has handed down a method of unifying with their dragons, in body and soul, known as Dragon Mastery. This allows them to become Drag Unity Knights who ride through the air. Final battle with the worms. As the worm invasion became strangely and increasingly sporadic, the Allies of Justice began constructing their ultimate weapon in preparation for the final battle. At the same time, they wound down production of their other weapons, and focused instead on creating other tools. The ultimate weapon was to be their ace in the hole, and as they constructed it, the Allies of Justice developed reconnaissance units mounted with monitoring equipment that was designed to predict where worms would appear. When they completed the final weapon, they used Genex controller as its central control core. As they'd anticipated, an ominous and terrifying worm appeared that was incomparable with any that they had encountered up to that point. Space tore apart, and from it, despair emerged. Zero increased its power by absorbing its worm kin, and then it created a new army. Everywhere it went was tainted and turned into dead earth, an enormous floating fortress, constructed to have the greatest firepower known to the planet, was lying in wait for the enemy's appearance. At the end of the fierce battle, in which the weapon and Zero attacked each other at the same time, the worms were eradicated. With the worms defeated, there was a short-lived peace, and it was then that the full-scale invasion of the Fabled began. The Fabled appear. For a brief moment, the tribes cheered excitedly as the world was finally rid of the worms. But the Fabled had been watching the final battle from the sidelines, and now, accompanied by the Fabled beasts, they made their move to conquer the world's surface. The seemingly endless conflicts that ravaged the surface world gradually wore down the boundary between it and the Fabled realm, eventually causing that boundary to disappear completely. The Fabled, serving as the Fabled army's vanguard, began pouring quietly out of the Fabled realm and threatening the tribes with their paranormal powers. The Genex allies are created, with the Fabled as their enemies. The Ally of Justice weapon series was no longer good enough, so their engineers began a military-focused conversion project on the Genex, a new version of their ongoing Genex weaponization plan. For the sake of their plans, the Allies asked Mist Valley to cooperate with them once again. Mist Valley agreed and sent its engineers, and the plan succeeded and resulted in the creation of the Genex allies. They took their old Ally of Justice machines, they repaired the Genex and installed them as central control cores. They equipped the Genex with new power reactors, thus, the Genex Ally series was created. Each tribe's Genex ally, the engineers of the Ally of Justice tribes advanced their own designs based on some basic specifications, resulting in Genex allies that reflected each of their strengths. Moreover, they offered each other the technology they developed in the process, and ended up pushing forward in pursuit of joint development. X-Saber model, Fabled model, Mist Valley model, and Ice Barrier model. Ice Barrier and Mist Valley joint development, a Genex ally developed by the Ice Barrier and Mist Valley. It possesses a power reactor based on the Genex that's both compact and high-powered. Fabled and X-Saber joint development. A Genex ally developed soon after Triarm by the joint efforts of the X-Sabers and the Fabled. The weapon equipped on its right arm can rotate, allowing it to adjust to situations on the fly. The Allies sent Triarm and Triforce to the front lines, one after the other. Jurak impact. The fabled assault against the Jurak reached its peak. With each passing day, the Jurak lost more and more energy, and the number of flames was reduced to half of what it was before the Fabled made their surprise attack. If things kept going that way, they would have been destroyed, so the Jurak made one final counterattack. The remaining Jurak clustered and transformed their bodies into a giant blazing meteor that fell on their own nest. The fire and impact turned the entire area, as far as the eye could see, into a sea of flames. The Fabled were reduced to ashes along with the nest, and from the fire-scorched remains, the Neo-Flamble were born. The Fabled in the Jurak nest who weren't obliterated by the impact started to flee, every man for himself. The hearts of the Jurak, who lost their bodies, became a part of the flames themselves, reincarnating as Neo-Flamble. The fire tribe's thoughts awakened an ancient deity of fire and flames which existed in a mythical age. Ancient Flamble deity, who had slept for eons, responded to the fire tribe's wishes and used its power to immolate the Fabled left in the Jurak nest until not even ashes were left. The seal of Trishula is undone, many of the Fabled were wiped out, but the remaining groups only intensified their attacks across the world. The seemingly endless conflict laid waste to the surface world and pushed its people into impoverishment and exhaustion. Having been driven to such a point, one faction among the Ice Barrier proposed releasing the third Ice Dragon. The Ice Barrier tribe was internally divided over the matter, but they ultimately unleashed the dragon. Powerful individuals among the Ice Barrier gathered and carefully shattered the seal one piece at a time. The rituals and procedures continued, day and night over a month, until the entire seal was broken. The third Ice Dragon seal is broken. The power of Trishula was terrifying and dreadful, and it destroyed all the Fabled on the planet. However, the Ice Barrier lost control of the beast, and it went into a furious rage, and the other dragons, as if in response, rampaged with it. They took every possible measure to reseal the dragons. In the unlikely event that the Ice Dragons went on a rampage, Duel was to serve as a safety device, but the Tiger King's power didn't match that of the 3 rampaging Ice Dragons, and it couldn't stop the madness and frenzy.